Hello, hope you all are doing well. We're going to go over that last question. There was only one question that I had for Chapter 6, Part B, and it is, what do you think will happen to Mr. Crankshot and the driver? So they're going through, they hear a big noise, and then they go to look for them, and they are gone. So this is an opinion question again, because we all can have different answers. But I think what happened to them has to do something with the Black Hood. He's just taken a little girl and they're looking for him. So maybe it's him. Maybe there was some wreck since there was a big bump, and but you would think if there was a wreck, they would be right there. So there could be tons of things that happen to them. But my guess is going to be something with the man in the black cloak. All right, we are going to start Chapter 7, which is going to be on page 91. We are going to backtrack just a little bit from the last sentence from page 90 in Chapter 6. The 4 horses were still on their harnesses, but the carriage had stopped dead in the road, right in the middle of the forest. Chapter 7. Serafina climbed slowly out of the carriage and stood at Braden's side. The forest surrounded them, black and impenetrable. The craggy bark trees packed densely together. Her legs jittered beneath her, filled with nervous impulse. She tried to steady her breathing. Her whole body wanted to move, but she forced herself to stay with Braden and Gideon. She watched and listened to the unnaturally quiet forest, extending her senses out into the void. She couldn't hear a single toad or a whippoorwill, but it felt like there was something out there, something big, but extremely quiet. She didn't even know how that was possible. Gideon stood beside her on full alert, staring into the trees. Whatever it was, he sensed it too. Braden looked warily out into the darkness that surrounded them and walked forward a few feet in the direction of the carriage was facing. "I wish I had a lantern," he said. "I can't see anything at all." The horses fidgeted in their harnesses, their hooves shifting uneasily in the gravel. "When they're scared, they move their feet," Braden said sympathetically. "They have no claws, no sharp teeth, no weapons. Their speed is their main defense." She marveled at how Braden didn't just see the horses but understood them, how they thought. When a breeze passed through the woods and rattled the branches of the trees, the horses spooked. All 4 of them pulled and tugged against their harnesses. It was like they were being attacked by some invisible predator. Squealing, the front 2 horses reared up on their hind legs and struck the air with their hooves. As Serafina shrank back from the danger in frightened dismay, Braden rushed forward to put himself between her and the horses. Standing in front of them, he raised his open hands to calm them. They towered over him, their eyes white with fear, their heads thrashing and their hooves flying. She was sure that they were going to kick him in the head, or slam him with a shoulder, or trample him to death. But he stood with his hands raised, speaking to them in a soft, gentle tones. "It's all right. We're all here," he said to them. "We're all together." To her astonishment, the horses were calmed by his presence and his words. He touched their shoulders with an outstretched hand and seemed to bring the rearing horses back to the ground. Then he held the head of the lead horse in his hands and pressed his forehead to the horse's forehead, so that they were looking at each other eye to eye. And he spoke to the horse in a quiet, reassuring tones. "We're all in this together, my friend. We're going to be all right. There's no need to run. No need to fight." The lead horse breathed heavily through its nose and listened to Braden's words, then settled and became still. The other horses quieted as well, reassured by the young master. "How did you—" she stammered. "These horses and I have been friends for a long time," he replied, but said nothing more. Still astounded by what he had done, she looked around their surroundings. What do you think frightened them? I don't know, he said. I've never seen them so scared. Braden turned and looked down the road ahead of them. He squinted into the darkness, and then he pointed. What's that up there? He asked. I can't make it out. Does the road turn? She looked in the direction he pointed. It wasn't a turn in the road. A huge tree with thick, gnarly branches and a scattering of blood-red leaves lay across the road, completely blocking their path. Suddenly, Mr. Crankshot emerged out of the darkness, trudging his way back to the carriage. We're going to need the axe, he grumbled angrily. Serafina and Braden looked at each other in surprise, then looked back at Mr. Crankshot. Where have you been? Braden asked. We're going to need the axe, Mr. Crankshot said again, ignoring the question. I'll get it, sir, the assistant coachman said as he came running up behind Mr. Crankshot. She hadn't noticed him before, but the assistant coachman was just a skinny boy with a mop of curly hair. He stood no taller than the shoulder of the lead horse and had thin arms and legs, bony knees and elbows, and a coltish skittishness about him. He wore a coachman's jacket, but it was several sizes too big in the shoulders, and the sleeves were too long. His black coachman's top hat had seemed ridiculously tall on his little head. The boy couldn't have been older than 10. He ran the rear of the carriage, opened the wood storage box, and grabbed the axe, which looked huge in his hands. That's Nolan, Braden said, leaning towards her. He's actually one of the best carriage drivers we have, and he takes very good care of the horses. Give it to me, Mr. Crankshot barked as he grabbed the axe out of Nolan's hand and stomped over to the fallen tree. I can help too, sir. I can, Nolan said, tagging along behind him with a much smaller hatchet. No, you can't. Just get out of my way, boy, Mr. Crankshot shouted. He just seemed irritated that Nolan was even there. Mr. Crankshot heaved the heavy axe behind him in a great sweeping swing and slammed the blade into the center of the trunk. The leaves of the tree shuddered with the force of the blow, but it hardly made any dent at all in the thick bark. He swung the axe again and again and finally cut through the bark. The wood chips began to fly. Serafina couldn't help but notice that the brute strength of the man, but it was hard for her to tell if this was the same type of strength as the man in the black cloak had possessed. At this rate, we're going to be here all night, Mr. Crankshot complained and just kept chopping. I'm sure I can help, sir. I'm sure I can, Nolan said enthusiastically, standing by with his hatchet ready. I'm sure you can't. Now, get back and stay out of my way, Mr. Crankshot shouted. You're no use to anybody here, boy. As the grumpy Mr. Crankshot made his war on the tree, Serafina noticed Braden looking around them, trying to figure out if there was a way to navigate the carriage around the obstacle, but the trees of this wicked forest grew so closely together that a man could barely get through them, let alone a carriage with a team of horses. Where are we? Serafina asked. I think we're about 11 or 12 miles from the estate of a place called Darden Forest, Braden said. There used to be an old town nearby. Haven't been any people living in that village for years, Mr. Crankshot grumbled as he chopped at the tree. Nothing but ghosts and demons left in these woods now. Serafina scanned the forest, filled with a sense of foreboding. It felt like they were being watched, but she couldn't figure out why she couldn't detect what or who was out there. Her ears twitched with nervousness. The trees slowly swayed back and forth in the wind. They were covered in a strange gray lichen and strung with grayish white moss, which hung down like the thin hair of an old dead woman. The branches buffeted and creaked, as if anxious in their flight. It appeared that many of the trees were dying. She walked along the length of the fallen tree and thought it was particular that the tree still held its red leaves this late in the year. But it was what she saw at the base of the trunk that truly disturbed her. Come look at this, Braden, she said. "What have you found?" he asked as he came up behind her. "I thought the tree must be an old snag that had rotted and fallen over in the last storm, but take a look. The stump of the tree didn't appear rotted, and it didn't have the fibrous appearance of a trunk that had been snapped by high winds. It was difficult to tell, but it almost appeared as if it had been gnawed by giant teeth or cut down with an axe." "Look at the angle here," Braden said, gesturing at the side of the stump in anger and confusion. "Someone purposely felled this tree so that it would block the road." Gideon barked and made Serafina jump a mile. As the dog kept barking, Braden knelt at his side and put his hands on the dog's back. "What's wrong, boy? What do you smell?" "If it's all right with you," Mr. Crankshaw said gruffly, "we're not going to wait around to find out." Spooked by the dogs and apparently convinced that he had cut enough of the trunk, Mr. Crankshaw dropped the axe, braced his heavy boots against the earth, and grabbed a hold of the branches. He tried to drag the tree off the road, but it was just far too larger for him to budge. Braden and Nolan ran forward and tried to help. The whole time, Gideon just kept barking. "Somebody hit that dog and shut it up," Mr. Crankshaw shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "Mr. Crankshaw, I think that we should turn the carriage around and go back the other way," Braden said sharply, obviously perturbed at his comment about the dog. Mr. Crankshaw agreed, but at that moment a loud cracking sound filled the forest air. Serafina crouched, prepared to spring. A great shattering of wood erupted into an explosive crash as a large tree fell across the road behind them. The horses squealed in panic and went up, rearing and striking, pulling on their leather harnesses and dragging the carriage across the ground, even though the brake was engaged and the wheels wouldn't turn. Their instinct was to run, whether they were free of the harnesses or not. Braden ran over to help them. "No, Braden," Serafina cried as she reached to stop him. The boy seemed determined to get himself killed or kicked by a horse. Braden leapt in front of the horses. He was able to calm them with a few soft words and quickly got them under control. Seeing that he was safe, Serafina scanned the forest in the direction of the fallen tree. That's when she realized that the worst had happened. The carriage, its 4 horses, the 4 humans, and the dog were now trapped on a section of road between 2 trees. Mr. Crankshaw, gripping the axe, stomped to the back of the carriage and shouted ferociously into the darkness, "Who's out there? Show yourself, you rotten, filthy swine!" Serafina looked into the darkness and waiting for an answer to come, but Mr. Crankshaw's words drifted out into the black nothingness without a reply. "Mr. Crankshaw," Braden said firmly, "we need to get back to cutting the tree in front of us. The safest course now is to press on to Asheville." "I just hope we can get out of there," Mr. Crankshaw carped beneath his breath, stomping back. As Mr. Crankshaw, Braden, and Nolan worked on the tree, Serafina couldn't help but look behind the carriage where the most recent tree had fallen. Gideon was looking at that direction as well, his eyes black in the starlight. "What do you think, boy?" she whispered as she crouched beside him and peering into the darkness. "Is there something out there?" She and the dog were on the same side now. She wondered about the second fallen tree. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was deliberately blocking them so they could not escape. She scanned the forest. She had a good sense, but she knew she couldn't smell nearly as well as Gideon, and he seemed to smell something right now. He wasn't barking anymore, but he was staring intently into the forest, waiting for something to appear. For all of his faults as a dog, he was a brave defender, but she hated this. The looking, the waiting, the feeling like a trap was slowly surrounding them. She couldn't stand it. She didn't know how to defend, but she knew how to hunt. And right now, it felt like they were the ones being hunted, and she didn't like that feeling one bit. She took a few steps forward into the forest to see how it felt. Her skin crawled with equal parts of fear and excitement. She was drawn to the forest. Her instinct was telling her to go deeper. She took a few more steps. Gideon looked at her and tilted his head as if to say, "Are you crazy? You can't go in there." But then she padded quietly into the trees and ducked into the underbrush and wanted to move, to prowl, to see what was out there. Whatever it was, she wanted to be the hunter, not the hunted. Leaving Gideon to guard the carriage, she crept deeper and deeper into the darkness of the forest. The very same black forest that her father had told her she was never to enter. The same dark forest that Crankshaw had said was filled with ghosts and demons. But she was calm. She was in the right place. She figured if her mother could move through the forest at night, then so could she. And that is where we're stopping today. Thank you.